key questions. Tonight's lesson, I knew I wanted to do this lesson, and since I knew I thought it was going to be a down night. There's actually more of you here than I expected because the basketball game's going on. I wanted to cover the Old Testament with you in one lesson. I'm going to take about 45 minutes or so to walk us through the Old Testament books, because one of the cards in the back of your verse pack are the books of the Bible. And a lot of you know the New Testament fairly well, which is great. That's wonderful. And to be honest, we use the New Testament probably more than we use the Old. Obviously, it's because it has the gospel. It concerns the church. And since we're a part of the church, it makes sense that we learn that, study that a little more. But the Old Testament is very valuable. And so tonight, what I want to do is take kind of a quick survey through the Old Testament. I'm going to grab one of your handouts here. Everyone's got one of these handouts, hopefully. I do. I'm picking one up so I remember the books of the Bible in order. Just kidding. I think I know them. Who knows? Some of them I'm going to go faster than others. I know some of you, I did a lesson like this about 2.5 years ago. So some of you have been with us more than 2-3 years are like, well, I already know all this, right? Because you remember every word of every lesson. I know that because you guys are good. No one's even laughing. Is this even on? Hello? Okay, there Annalise is. Thank you. Thank you, Annalise. Somebody nice to have you back. I know someone at least is listening. All right, so we're going to begin. We're just going to walk through these. We might get done quicker than I think. We'll see how fast we go. I am using some pictures here from Walk Through the Bible, and we purchased these several years ago after going to one of their conferences, and they're really helpful for those of you that are visual learners. I mean, some of you are more auditory or more kinesthetic, but for those of us that are visual learners, having just a single picture to go with a book of the Bible can be really helpful. And just remembering some of the key content. Now, Genesis has 50 chapters. There's no way to represent all what's in all 50 chapters by one single picture, okay? I'm not going to do that. But we do get the big idea of Genesis here. And in your notes, I've got the books of the Bible in one column, and I've got kind of the big idea in the next column, and then some books I've written extra information about that would just be good to know. And I will tell you now, we're going to do a quiz game of some sort next week, and all the answers to that quiz will come first and foremost off of this sheet right here, front and back. So all those basketball players that are not here will be at a severe disadvantage. You guys will be at the advantage. Is that good? Yeah, all right, because you're spiritual. I'm not saying that at all. All right, so go tell your basketball players to go look up the YouTube video, and they'll get the answers that way. So Genesis, what do you notice about the letter? There's a certain letter in Genesis that is kind of augmented here. What's the letter? What is it? It's a big N, which reminds us that the key thought in the book of Genesis is beginning. Big N, beginning. And the book of Genesis has the beginning of everything, obviously creation, but it also has the beginning of the nation of Israel, has the beginning of the family with Adam and Eve and their children, has the beginning of some bad things too, beginning of sin entering the human race. The first murder is recorded in Genesis. A lot of stuff begins in the book of Genesis, so it's a foundational book of beginnings. We have also last year learned a simple outline for Genesis. I'm not putting it up on the screen, but remember there were four great events, and they were creation, fall, flood, Tower of Babel. And after that there were four great people, all in the same family, grandpa to all the way down here, or actually great-grandpa all the way down to great-grandson. Who's the first one? Abraham, his son Isaac, his son Jacob, whose name is changed to what? Israel. And then Jacob's son? Joseph, right. And so those are key people in the book. And if you can remember that simple outline, it will be an easy way to remember really much better than just the word beginning what's in the book of Genesis. Next book of the Bible is Exodus. Key concept in Exodus is that they exit Egypt. But I also would love for you to remember kind of the three main things that are in Exodus, in addition to, oh, by the way, who leads them out of Egypt? Moses, yes, thank you. Avi setting it to music for us. We appreciate that. Moses. She did better. He is called of God, remember the burning bush, and is sent back to Egypt, where he had actually been raised in the household of Pharaoh. He goes back and he tells Pharaoh, let my people go. Yes. And after a few minutes of thinking about it, Pharaoh decides, yeah, it's a good idea, I think let him go, right? Something else had to happen first. What happened first? Anybody remember? Plagues. How many? 10 plagues, yes. Well, there were 7. There just were 3 more after that, yeah. 10 plagues upon Egypt, and finally Pharaoh lets them exit Egypt. The word exodus means exit. I like to remember in the book of Exodus, Exodus is the second book of the Bible, and so it's time to eat you a sandwich because you're just getting started. You need lots of energy to make it through the Old Testament. You need a sandwich. You don't want a BLT sandwich. You need an ELT sandwich because this is the book of Exodus. And ELT stands for Exodus, which is the first part of the book. The L stands for what's in the middle of the book, right smack dab in the middle of the book. It's the, anybody remember? Law. Very good. 10 Commandments, the law. So we have the Exodus, the law, and the last part of the book is the less than exciting part of the book, where we get all these measurements and all these different materials and everything because they're told how to build the tabernacle. ELT stands for Exodus, Law, Tabernacle. Exodus is about exiting Egypt under Moses' leadership. Okay, next book of the Bible. This is probably my favorite picture of all the 39 pictures you will see tonight. This one is the best one. Because this guy here, you can tell who this guy is because he's wearing Levi's. Okay, that gives you a pretty good idea who this guy is. He's a Levite. And this just happens to be the priestly tribe. But as he is wearing his Levi's there, this other guy, what is that guy dressed kind of in that beige tan color? What's he doing? Can you tell what he's doing there in that picture? Okay, Nathan knows. He's heard this many times. What is it? Left foot a kiss. Yes, he's giving his left foot a kiss. Therefore, this is the book of Leviticus or Leviticus. Pretty much the same thing, right? All right, this is the best picture. Okay, because we've got this Levite there. You know he's a Levite because he's wearing his Levi's. Okay, he's from the holy priestly tribe of the Levites. And he's holding up 2 things here. And those 2 things are what this book is all about. Okay, the first one's got a big turkey on there. This is not what they really would have originally looked like, but, no, actually the first one's got the cash on there. The first one's got all this cash on there. And what do you think of when you see a plate with money passed around at church? That's the offering. So this book is about offerings. Now, they really weren't offerings like that, right? They were butchering animals and slitting their throats and blood was spurting everywhere. But that doesn't make a good PG picture for us, okay? So we just got a plate of cash. I know, Asher's disappointed. Anyway, so we have offerings, and then the other side's got all this food on it, offerings and feasts. The holidays that Israel will celebrate, the feasts that they will mark, and the offerings that they will collect. This is really an instruction manual for the priests, and they're told about offerings and feasts. Okay, an instruction manual for the priests, all about offerings and feasts. Yeah, that kind of rhymes. Okay, moving on. Next here, I didn't give you the book here, but what do you see pictured up in front here? What do you got up there? Bunch of numbers. This is the book of Numbers. And what are these numbers doing? They are wandering around. Yes, they are wandering. They are wandering aimlessly in the desert, in the wilderness. And that's what happens during the book of Numbers. They wander around. You remember why? Because actually it doesn't take 40 years to get from Egypt to the land of Israel. It only takes a couple months. But what happened once they got there was they sent in 12 spies to spy out the land, see what it looks like. And when those spies reported back, what did the spies say? Anybody remember that story? Yeah, what did they say, Ruth? They say, those people in there are huge. They're giants. Yeah, we can't take them. We're just like little grasshoppers compared to them. And I mean, yeah, there's lots of great food and lots of wealth, and the land looks great. It flows with milk and honey. But no, those guys are too big. We can't. So 10 of the 12 spies give a bad report. Joshua and Caleb, on the other hand, say, hey, we can do this. We can handle these guys. We'll take them. If God's for us, who can be against? We'll do this. But unfortunately, the crowd yields and follows after the 10. And so as a result, God says, because of your lack of faith, you'll wander in the wilderness for the next 40 years or so. So wandering is what occurs here. So 12 spies, only 2 had faith, and they wander for 40 years as a result. The next book, the last book of the law, the last book of the Pentateuch, the first part of the Bible, is this book right here. Now, this picture might take a little. First of all, what is printed on the ground there? Me. Me is on the ground. Okay, I know that's lousy English. Me is on the ground, but that's what we see. And then we have these 2 stone tablets. And what do you have? And what are the 2 stone tablets doing? They're doing 2 things. They're running, and what else are they doing? They're singing. Okay, when you have 2 of something singing, what do you call that? A duet. So what we have here is a duet run on me, or Deuteronomy. Duet run on me, or Deuteronomy. All right? Okay, some of these pictures will haunt you in your sleep for the next week or so. That's okay, because it's going to help you to remember what's in these books. Well, this duet is the law. The word Deuteronomy doesn't literally mean duet run on me. It means second law. Now, Israel didn't get a second law, but they got the law given to them for a second time. And that's what happens to Deuteronomy. In Exodus, God meets Moses up on Mount Sinai. He presents him with those tablets, and he gives him the law. And now 40 years later, they're camped on the plains of Moab. They're finally about ready to go into the promised land. But it's a whole new generation. All those old guys that were there with Moses, most of them have all died out. And so it's important the law be given again, reminding them of why they're here, why it took them so long to get here, by the way, and what God has in store for them in the promised land, and how they are going to follow him, and what is expected of them as they enter the promised land. So it's a second law, it's a second telling of the law, Deuteronomy, or duet run on me. And we have now completed the first 5 books, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. The word Pentateuch just means 5 books of law, sometimes called the Torah. We finished that. So let me go back real quick here. So we have Genesis, beginnings. Exodus, they exit from Egypt. Leviticus, there's no movement in this book. They're still camped there at Mount Sinai, but the Levites are given instructions in offerings and feasts. Then, because of their lack of faith, they wander for 40 years in the wilderness, in the book of Numbers. And then in Deuteronomy, duet run on me, they are reminded of the law as they get ready to enter the promised land. Okay, the next section begins a section of history. Now, I'm not saying that there wasn't history in those first 5 books. There was. But these books we consider the books of history. And here, the first one we actually have this picture. I'm going to be interested to get to heaven to see if he really looks like this or not. I'm pretty confident he didn't wear these shades back then. I'm not sure. But anyway, this is Joshua. It's a picture of Joshua. And you can see the walls are all crumbled around him. He is on a conquest. He is there to conquer. And so the word for Joshua is conquest. Joshua's there to take over. And if you actually are reading through the book of Joshua, how many have read the book of Joshua before? Any of you read the book? Okay. If you get going in the book of Joshua, the first part of the book has got all these cool stories. I mean, first they cross the Jordan River. That's pretty cool. And Joshua actually meets up with probably a pre-incarnate Jesus the commander of the Lord's army. Anyway, it's mysterious who it is. They cross the Jordan River. They get to Jericho. They fight this great battle. The walls come down. There's setbacks along the way, to be sure, but lots of neat stuff. And then you get to the second half of Joshua. And that's a snooze fest, because it's like, okay, from this border here, from this rock to that tree to the bend in that river, that's your property, Dan. And from this city to that molehill over there to I'm making this up, but I mean, it's just a bunch of boundary markers. It's not exciting unless you're from the tribe of Dan or Gad or Asher, and this is where you're going to set up, and this is where you're going to live for the rest of your life and raise your children, and your grandchildren are going to be born here. For them, it was pretty exciting. For most of us, it's a snooze fest. So the first part is conquest. The second part is division. They're dividing up the land. So that's the 2 parts of Joshua. One pretty exciting, one not so exciting, both important though, especially for those who were first hearing it. The next book, we had a little mini-series in not that long ago. It's the book of Judges. What's the theme for the book of Judges? Cycles of sin. Yeah, there were 7 cycles of sin throughout this book. And so during the time of the Judges, remember, it's a time period where everyone does what's right in their own eyes, because there's no king in Israel, there's no one leader, but God does raise up these judges, these leaders at different times over a few tribes one place or a few tribes someplace else. Some of the key ones were Gideon and Jephthah. Remember Deborah and Barak. Remember Samson was one of the final ones that we read about. So these are some of the people that are during the book of Judges, a time when really the dark ages of Israel's history. I didn't put anything extra in your notes other than just some of the key people, but there's about 350 years or so, 350 to 400 years takes place during this time period of the Judges. And it's not a lot, most things that happen in this book, while they may be exciting to read about, aren't really holy, aren't really spiritual. Even the good guys in Judges aren't really that good of guys. God shows up and he helps deliver his people, but the book is full of really lists a lot of anarchy, what happens when we turn our backs on God. But during the time period of the Judges, there is one really beautiful story that takes place during this, and that's our next book. And this book is easy to remember. See, we've got this overhead here. That is a book. And what is that book? What is that book being used as? It's a roof. So this is the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth, yeah. And Ruth is a love story. See the pretty picture? It's a love story between Ruth. Does anybody know the guy that ends up marrying her? Boaz. Very good. It's a story of Ruth, and Boaz is a love story. Boaz is her nearest kin. He redeems her, and he becomes her husband. He cares for her, and they end up being great-grandparents of King David, which means they end up in the line of Christ. Pretty exciting stuff. It's a great love story during a time of anarchy, during the time of the Judges. All right, our next book, if you're with us on Sunday morning, this is the book we're studying right now. Now, okay, now, whoa. Now, this is very obvious here if you think about it. First of all, let's look at what we have right here. Now, this right here. Does anybody know what this is? It's made out of sand. You got that right, but it's not a donkey per se. It's a sand mule. So this is the book of 1 Samuel. Samuel, okay? All right. So 1 Samuel. Now, in the book of 1 Samuel, some of you are seeing this for the first time and just think I'm crazy, but I didn't come up with these, okay? In the book of 1 Samuel, mainly describes the kingship of one individual. And this right here reminds us who it is. What's he holding? Saul. This is King Saul. Saul, kind of sounds the same, doesn't it? So 1 Samuel, King Saul. 1 Samuel, King Saul. So you saw 1 Samuel. Well, it's time for the 2 Samuel here. 2 Samuels. And who's the king in this one here? How do you know it's David? He's got a slingshot. Now, this is confusing. So which book of the Bible, if I want to find the story of David killing Goliath, which book of the Bible am I going to look in? Yeah, it's actually 1 Samuel. Why is it 1 Samuel? Because Saul was king when David killed Goliath. Remember, David wasn't king there. The slingshot just helps you figure out that's David. But the actual occurring of the killing Goliath, that happened in 1 Samuel. So a little tricky there, a little tricky. Don't let the picture throw you off. It's just to remind you, 1 Samuel, King Saul. 2 Samuel, King David. Okay? Moving, let's see, do I have any other notes in that? No, I don't. All right, next picture here. Now we have front and center here. We have a king. Thank you. He's a king, yes. How many kings do you see? 1 king, okay? So this is the book of 1 Kings. Now, there's actually quite a lot in this photo. No, it's not a photo, okay. It's not really what Solomon, in this picture, there's quite a lot in this picture, okay. First of all, we find out who the king is by looking at his heart. And he's kind of got this half-hearted devotion. He starts off really good. God asks him what he wants. He doesn't ask for wealth or riches or a beautiful wife or any of those kind of things. He asks for wisdom. That's great. He's off to a great start. Sadly, though, over the course of his life, he drifts from the Lord. And one of the reasons he drifts, well, the main reason he drifts from the Lord is pictured in the background there. What do you see in the background? Yeah, a lot of women. Yeah, it's not just one woman, it's a lot of women. He marries all these wives, has all these concubines, and what they do is they pull his heart away from God after other gods. So while Solomon started off really good, he ends poorly. Matter of fact, God tells him as a result of that the kingdom is going to be divided. So as you see here, Solomon was the richest king of all the kings of Israel. But what happens to his money bag here? What happens to it? It splits. And during 1 Kings, we see the beginnings of the downfall of Israel here. And so what happens is the kingdom splits in two. So in your notes there, I just told you, 1 Kings, we have King Solomon, and the kingdom is divided. Two kingdoms. They're divided in the north. We have the kingdom of Israel. The 10 tribes go with Rehoboam. They are the northern tribes. In the south, the predominant tribe is Judah. So the two kingdoms become Israel and Judah. No longer a united Israel, but now an Israel and Judah. Two kingdoms for the rest of these books of history. All right? So we go to, well, it was 1 king, so this must be 2 Kings, right? Because there's 2 kings. Now what's important in this picture is where these 2 kings are, okay? So where are they located? What are they on? They're on an isle, yes, an island. But it's not just any isle or island. It's an exile. So what happens is both kingdoms go into exile. They are carted off. First, the nation of Assyria comes and defeats the northern kingdom of Israel. And then around a little over 100 years later, Babylon comes and conquers the southern kingdom of Judah and takes them away to exile. And when we get to the end of 2 Kings, we have pretty well told the story of the monarchy in the nation of Israel. Then we come to the next 2 books, and it's what we have up here is a newspaper or a chronicle, right? And sometimes a newspaper is named a chronicle, and it just means, it's a commentary. It's a description of the events that are going on. What happens in 1 Kings is we have an editorial where the writer of, 1 Chronicles, what happens in 1 Chronicles is our writer, the person writing this, goes back and writes a special editorial about one particular person. Do you recognize that person? Yeah, it's this guy right here, King David, right? Okay, so what we have in first, yeah, he still does. Yeah, he's got a slingshot there. All right, it's hard to see. It's a black and white newspaper. This is an old chronicle, okay? So 1 Chronicles goes back and basically retells the story of David. Now this is important because if you've ever sat down to read through your Bible and kind of just chronologically read through the Bible, you're going to get to the end of 2 Kings, if you try to do this, and then you're going to go to 1 Chronicles and you're going to start scratching your head. There's this big old long 9 chapters of genealogies, and then by the time you get to chapter 10, it's like, wait a minute, we're talking about David again. David died a long time ago. David died back here at the end of 2 Samuel. Why am I reading about David? Because Chronicles goes back and reviews the history of David's kingship. And then 2 Chronicles continues that story, but now emphasizes the kingdom of Judah. So 2 Chronicles it does mention the northern kingdom of Israel, but it's really got a focus on the southern kingdom of Judah. So when you're thinking of the history books of the Old Testament, Chronicles goes back and reviews what's in 2 Samuel and 1 and 2 Kings. So you're going to get a double dose of those books when you get to the books of Chronicles. So that kind of ends. So once again, at the end of 2 Chronicles, we end at pretty much the same place we ended at the end of 2 Kings. The nations are in captivity, things are really bad, and then our last 3 books of history. And these are pretty short little books of history. The first one here, what's the letter we have here? S. And what's S saying? So it's Ezra, yes, the book of Ezra, okay? Ezra, this is the book of Ezra. And he's going, Ezra, he's all excited about something. What is going on there in the background? What's just been built? The temple. You see, when Babylon came down and took away Judah into captivity, they laid waste to the temple. But now Cyrus, king of Persia, has given Zerubbabel permission to go back to the land. And he goes back with many of the captives of Israel to reestablish their presence once again there in the land of Israel. And they're all excited about that. One of the things that happens when they go back, Zerubbabel goes back and they begin rebuilding the temple. And then Ezra goes back and reads the law to them and helps them to understand what's going on in the law, what they should be doing, what God's expectations are of them now that they're back in their land. So this is pretty exciting. It's a lot to be Ezra-ing about, being excited about, because they're back in the promised land. The temple's been rebuilt. It's not as nice as Solomon's temple was, but still they're back in the promised land. And then the next book of history is this book right here. And you can see as he's building there, about how high is that wall there? That's about knee high, isn't it? So this is the book of Nehemiah, okay? This is the book of Nehemiah. See, because Nehemiah is the star, that's why, okay? So Zerubbabel goes back with some people. Ezra goes back with some people. That's in the book of Ezra. Now Nehemiah goes back with some people. And they go back to rebuild the walls, because until the walls are rebuilt around Jerusalem, they're always going to be at the mercy of people around them coming and invading and attacking. And so it's important for them to have the shelter of the city-state walls there. So the walls are rebuilt under Nehemiah despite a whole bunch of opposition. Nehemiah is a pretty cool book to read about if you're trying to do a special project for God and need some encouragement. Nehemiah is a great book to go to get some encouragement, because he faced all kind of opposition and yet he came through and got the task done. All right, so that's Nehemiah. That's almost the last book of history. There's one more book, and this book is chronologically doesn't happen after Nehemiah. This book we're going to look at actually happened in the middle of the book of Ezra. And this book is the book of, let's see, what's the letter we got here? What's this lady doing with that S? So this is the book of Esther. Esther. All right. And Esther is a really cool book about this person here. She is a queen, and you can tell what she's queen of by looking at the cat and the rug here. There's a Persian rug, Persian cat. So she is a queen of Persia. Okay, Esther's a queen of Persia. You guys ought to be reading about her right now, right? Yes, that's where we're at in our quiet times right now. Esther did not go back with Zerubbabel. Her and her cousin Mordecai were still there in the kingdom of Persia, and she ends up becoming exalted to becoming the queen of Persia, and in doing so, she is able from that position to be able to save all the rest of the people in Israel from the wicked Haman and his plan to destroy the Jews. All right, that's the final book. And again, that's not chronological order. That happens in the middle of Ezra. But that's the final of the history books. A lot of you probably could pick out and tell some of those stories, and some of you could have done just what I did right now, going through and reviewing that history. But now we're going to start getting into a little more muddy waters. In the middle of our Old Testament, we have these 5 books that are written in a poetic style. The first one doesn't really read in our modern English like a poem, like poetry, and yet that is, in the original Hebrew, kind of the style to it. This is a book about, and I didn't put the name in your notes here, this is a book about a man who is put through the ringer. Satan comes and attacks him and tempts him and challenges him and does all kind of terrible things to his family, to his possessions, even to his body. But all along the way, God says, you can do this much and no more. Yes, Satan, you can do this to him, but I won't let you do this. Satan, you're allowed to do this, but you cannot cross this line. And first of all, who's this book about? Who is this guy? Job. Yes, it's the book of Job. And what we discover in the book of Job, despite all of his adversities, despite all the difficulties that he goes through, he's in God's hands throughout. And really the big word I'd like you to remember, even though it's not so much pictured there, well, I guess it is, being in God's hands, but it's the word sovereignty. God's sovereignty, his control, his care is taken care of. Job is in God's hands, but that's because God's in control. Because God is taking care of Job, even if Job doesn't necessarily feel like it. By the time you get to the end of the book of Job, Job is exhausted. I think he's exhausted physically. I think he's exhausted mentally. I think he's exhausted socially from his friends who've come and just badgered him with all kinds of terrible questions because they've misread what's going on in his life. And Job was just like, oh, God, this is just awful. I can't believe this has happened. Where are you in all this, God? What's happened? And then God kind of comes at the end and says, Job, I've been in control all along. Where were you when I laid out the world? Where were you when I said the ocean can go this far and no farther? Where were you when I put all the stars in place and I told the continents they could go so far and no farther? He says, I'm God. You trust me. And at the end, Job comes back with this quote that you guys are learning in your Bible verses this year, where Job says, I know you can do everything, and that no purpose of yours can be withheld from you. And that's what we want to come to the conclusion when we read this book of Job. The next book of poetry does look a lot more like songs or poems, and we've got some songs being sung and prayers being made by whom? Who's doing that? Palms. Yeah, we got these palms. So this is the book of Psalms. Okay, well, Psalms. Okay, the P is silent. Psalms here, yeah. So this is the book of Psalms, and Psalms is a book of worship. Worship is the key word. Whether you're praying, whether you're singing, it's a book directing our hearts, our thoughts, our minds, our emotions, our intellect on God. It's a book of worship, and so it's a great book. 150 chapters. More chapters than any other book of the Bible. Some very long. The longest chapter in the Bible, Psalm 119, were 172, 174 verses, I forget. All but one or two of them mentioning God's word one way, shape, or form. And the 23rd Psalm, a lot of you know, Psalm 1. A lot of familiar memory verses have come from the book of Psalms, but it's a book of worship. The next book of poetry reads very differently, even though it's also in this same passages, the same spot in the Bible, and it's a book about wisdom. And you'll see here that this wise old owl is putting a proverb on the board there. A fool and his money are... Actually, that's not even a proverb from the Bible. I don't know why they used that picture. I used that proverb. There's lots of good proverbs you could have put in there. But anyway, it's the book of Proverbs. And Proverbs was compiled by Solomon. They're not all necessarily written by Solomon, but he compiles most of them, puts them together for us, and they're statements of wisdom. They are not carte blanche promises necessarily, but they're principles. They're proverbs. They're things that are generally true. And if you learn to live by the book of Proverbs, as a general rule, you're going to have success. You're going to be blessed as you trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean on your understanding, and all your ways acknowledge him. And he shall direct your paths. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and depart from evil. It will be health to your flesh and strength to your bones. Honor the Lord with your possessions, with the first fruits of all your increase. And on Proverbs chapter 3 goes. The thing is, it doesn't necessarily guarantee you that if I honor God, I'm going to always have riches and wealth and be well taken care of. Sometimes that's not true. There are a lot of stories of martyrs that wasn't true of. But as a general rule, as you live a life that is godly, that is in accord with the principles of Proverbs, you will be blessed. So it's a book of Proverbs, wisdom. All right, is that all we had in our notes there? Yes. Oh, how many chapters in this book? Does anybody know? 31. And the only reason I put that down in your notes is that it's a cool book to get in the habit of reading today's proverb. You know, look up whatever today's date is, 26th? 26th today or 20th? I forget. I wasn't at work today, so I didn't write the date a single time today. 26. So it's kind of cool to get in the habit of reading, like the 26th chapter of Proverbs. Read a Proverbs a day. Now, if you get to February, and you have to cram a bunch in on the 28th, I suppose. But it's just a good idea to get in the habit. Do that for a year or so. Man, will it help you to think rightly. Be a man or a young woman of wisdom. All right, the next one, I've augmented this picture just a little bit here. So after the book of Proverbs, we have, we have a vanity, yes, here. And can you see what's in the mirror in the vanity? Nothing, absolutely nothing. The key word in this book is vanity or emptiness or meaninglessness. It's the book of Ecclesiastes. And it's the book that Solomon has given us to help remind us that if all we have in life is just the stuff that we earn or the things we enjoy or the pleasures that we have, apart from God, our life is vanity. It's meaningless. So apart from God, that's what our life is. It's empty. It's void. It's vanity. And that's the case that Solomon makes during these chapters in the book of Ecclesiastes. One more book, and you'll also recognize, hopefully, this king again. What king is this? So Solomon's written this book as well. What's he doing now, though? He's singing. So yes, it's the Song of Solomon. And the book of the Song of Solomon is about love in, what's going on here? Can you tell what's going on? Marriage, yes, love in marriage. Solomon and this Shulamite woman, and it's a beautiful picture of love in marriage. It's also the one rated R book in the Bible, okay? I'll just tell you that because, and they use some interesting expressions about things that are lovely. And he compares his wife, well, I just won't go any farther, but anyway, it's got some interesting descriptors in it. Yes, they probably don't make the best Valentine lines. Okay. Now we are ready for what I think is probably the hardest part of the Old Testament, okay? And I've given myself about 10 minutes to do it in. Hope I can do it. We're going to go through the major and then the minor prophets, okay? The only thing that makes the major prophets major is they're longer. That's the only thing, really. So let's talk about the books of the prophets, okay? So flip your sheet over, if you will. Our first one here, first we have to figure out who this is, okay? So what letter do we have here? And what is I doing? Isaiah. This is the book of Isaiah, because Isaiah. And in the book of Isaiah, it maybe isn't the best picture, but one thing it does very good is it reminds us that Isaiah fits cleanly into two sections. The first section of Isaiah is, we're going to call it groaning. In the first section, it's judgment, and there's just bad things that are happening to the children of God. It's about groaning and longing for God to deliver and God to do something. The second half of the book, we have this guy, he's all excited. He's going, glory. We go from groaning to glory in this book because in the second half, we start talking about the Messiah. And the Messiah is going to come. And he is going to set all things right. And he's going to deliver us. And probably the most important passage you might think of in that book of Isaiah is chapter 53. That key chapter where we read about the suffering Messiah who's wounded for our transgressions, who's bruised for our iniquities, the chastisement that brought us peace is upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. So Isaiah 53, probably a key chapter in that book, but the second half all about the Messiah. So we go from groaning to glory in the book of Isaiah. The next book here, well, first we have to see what's going on right here. What do we have here? These are folks that are in the jury box. So this is the book of Jeremiah, okay? So you see the jury, this is the book of Jeremiah, okay? And what we've done is, it's a long book, over 60 chapters in this book. We've just pulled out one illustration to help us to see what God was seeing in the nation of Israel. So it's like we're in a courtroom here, and Jeremiah is holding up this rotten sash. Jeremiah is told to take this sash and go and bury it in the ground. It stays in the ground for a time. Then he goes back and he unburies it and pulls it up, and he holds it up. God has him hold it up, and it says it's worthless. It's good for nothing. It's no longer useful at all. He says, you, Judah, are like that rotten sash. That's how you have become in my sight. Jeremiah is sometimes described as the weeping prophet because he is called to minister during the dark days in Israel's history. They are being carted off into captivity. Judgment has come. God has withheld, has taken away his hand of blessing, and the nation of Judah is being taken away into captivity. So it's a dark time. So here Jeremiah is. He says, this is why, guys. This is what you've done to yourselves, as he holds up that rotten sash. And we continue that theme because Jeremiah wrote this book as well. And in this book, first of all, we have a little lamb. This is a lamb. And so this is the book of Lamentations, okay, because we have a lamb. And what's going on with the lamb? What's it doing? It's crying. And in Lamentations, there are tears for the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem has fallen. The great capital of God's city has fallen to the Babylonians. And so it is a time of weeping, lamenting. So Lamentations contains just exactly what you would think it would. this great lament. Yet, in the midst of our lamenting, God is still faithful. And so that is communicated in the book as well. But we're Lamentations. All right, in the next book here, we're going to remember one key event in this book, or one key vision that God gives to this prophet. Ezekiel, they put the letters easy up there to make it easy for us to remember Ezekiel. And Ezekiel sees this vision of this valley of, what do we got here? A bunch of bones. Only what kind of bones are they? Well, they're dry bones. Yeah, he's drying off. So he sees this valley of dry bones. And Ezekiel is one of those prophets during the time of exile. And everyone's downcast and discouraged. And what God does is he gives Ezekiel this vision. He says, I want you to see this valley, see all this death and destruction, see all these dead bones here. Do you think those bones can come back to life? And in Ezekiel's vision, all of a sudden, muscle, tendons, and sinews and stuff come together, and these bones come back to life. And God says, in just the same way, I'm going to bring the nation of Israel back as well. As he sees this valley of dry bones. God's still going to work in the nation of Israel, the nation of Judah, despite all the difficulties that they see going on during the time of Ezekiel. All right, the next book, Ezekiel, after that comes, you can guess, yeah, you know who this is by the lion's den, right? This is Daniel, the book of Daniel. And while probably the things that are most memorable for us is in the book of Daniel would be either Daniel in the lion's den, which happened very late in his life, by the way. He wasn't a young man. He'd have been an old man during that time period when he was locked up with the lions. Or you might think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That story's in here as well earlier on. But the main thing we remember for Daniel is the dreams God gave him. Dreams that Daniel was then given the interpretation of, either his own dreams or dreams of kings that he would interpret for. And some of these dreams contain visions that we are still seeing unfold even today, visions of the next world empires that would come upon the scene. And some of Daniel's visions have yet to be fulfilled. So some of the prophecies that will eventually be fulfilled, you and I think of predominantly in like Revelation, they are outlined in the book of, at least the timetables given to us, in the book of Daniel. So dreams of the future, dreams of God's protecting his people, dreams that show, once again, God's sovereignty. He's already got the end figured out. He has it under control. Then we get to the minor prophets, these last 12 that are probably the most difficult ones, but you will never forget this next picture because this lady here has an interesting garb on there. What's she wearing? Hose, yeah, this is the book of Hosea, yeah. And in the book of Hosea, what we have here, you can tell what kind of woman she is, okay? She's a woman of the night. She is a harlot. She's a harlot. In the book of Hosea, this is kind of a rated R book too, you think about it. There's several rated R books in the Bible, aren't there? Because in the book of Hosea, Hosea is actually commanded to go and marry this harlot. And knowing she's going to be unfaithful to him. And guess what? She's unfaithful to him. And he has to go and buy her back from the slave market because she sold herself into sexual sin. But he goes and he buys her back. And God says, you know what that is? That is a picture of my relationship with my people. They've sold themselves off to unfaithfulness. They have been adulterous. They have committed spiritual adultery against me, their God. And I've had to go and bring them back and drag them back once again. So Hosea is a story of God's redemption, but of Israel's sin as well. Hosea, harlot. All right, our next book is, this is one of the worst ones, I think. But anyway, what we have here is a plate of, and Jello is supposed to sound like Joel. Whatever. Okay. I think by the time they got to the minor prophets, the people that made these pictures were just getting tired. Okay, let's give it to them. So this is a plate of Jello Joel, okay? But if you remember the picture, it does describe the significant event that happens that is being addressed in the book of Joel, and that is a plague of locusts. And so locusts have come, judgment has come upon God's people. And just as and God writes the book of Joel is delivered by the prophet to help the people see this is not just some normal condition that just happens because we're living on planet Earth, some natural disaster. No, this plague of locusts is God's judgment. God's judgment has come upon us, and then there's future judgment that will come as well. Just as surely as these locusts have come, future judgment during the day of the Lord will come as well. The next book, once again, we're going to use one of the illustrations that's used in this book. But before we talk about that, let's talk about the name of the book. What kind of animal do we have here? We have a moose. So this is the book of Amos. Okay. Now, a moose here is holding up something that I bet most of you, I wrote it in your notes already, so you've got the word there in your notes, but most of you have probably never seen. He's holding up a plumb line. And so when a builder is going to build a house and looking at the foundation, trying to make sure the walls and everything are straight, he will hold up a plumb line. Of course, gravity would hold that string taut, and you'd be able to see whether, when you would compare that string to the wall or whatever you were building, to see if it was straight or if it was crooked or not. And so in the book of Amos, God says, I've held up my plumb line, and I'm looking at you, and guess what? You're crooked. You're wicked. Israel, you deserve judgment. You are not walking the straight and narrow. So the plumb line is used by Amos, by God, to show the nation of Israel just how wicked and out of step they were. The next minor prophet, this is the shortest book in the Old Testament. One chapter, and it's not even that long. And so you won't fall asleep reading this book probably, but in case you do, we have an Obed for you. And so this is the book of Obadiah. Okay? Obadiah, one short little book, and basically it deals with, well, what we might call Israel's brother. In your picture here, we've got guys that almost look like they're twins here, don't they? One of them, they got their names on the shirt. One of them is Israel. The other one is Edom. Do you remember the story of Jacob and Esau? Those two brothers, Jacob's name was changed to Israel. Esau was the forefather of the Edomites. Edom means red. And so essentially what we have here are two twin kingdoms, Israel and Edom. Israel is attacked, and Edom moves in for the killed in the midst of that. Rather than helping out its brother, Edom celebrates Israel's defeat, Israel being attacked. And so the whole book of Obadiah, it's only one chapter, is about God rebuking the Edomites because they didn't come to the aid of Israel. Instead, they actually celebrated Israel's defeat. Edom should have been its brother's keeper. So brother's keeper is the expression here. Brother's keeper. They should have cared for their brother, their kin, but instead they did not. So brother's keeper is the terminology for, the key word for Obadiah. All right, if you don't get this one, I might just hang it up. What do you think this might be a picture of? Yeah, okay. The key word is fish, and it's the book of Jonah. So make sure you write in, I think just great fish, right? The book of Jonah, though, is all about God's compassion. God's compassion in response to Nineveh's repentance. You know, God sends Jonah with this message of judgment, and all he says is this message of judgment. God's going to destroy the city. Your wickedness has come before the Lord. You're under judgment. God's going to judge you. But the people of Nineveh, which was part of the Assyrian Empire, the people of Nineveh actually repent of their sin. And so God relents and does not send his judgment. It's a picture of God's compassion, but we'll come back to Nineveh in just a few minutes. The next book that we have for us here, first of all, what is this right here? Can you tell what that is? It's a mic. So this is the book of Micah, okay? And in the book of Micah, once again, and some of these books are kind of repeating some of the same themes here, but we're having to come up with new pictures for each book. So here we have what the sun oftentimes stands in for a day, because you think of the sun coming up, it's daytime. So in the book of Micah, Israel has its day in court. Day in court. So that's what you want to write down, day in court. And here what's going on in the book of Micah is, particularly Judah's leaders are being judged. God is holding them up as if they were in a courtroom setting and laying out all the different accusations against them, what they've done wrong. and how they've led the people into wickedness, and Judah is being judged by God. Israel's getting its day in court. The next book takes us, and this is so easy, the book is written right there on the screen, right? Okay, so don't miss that one. The book of Nahum. I guess they couldn't figure out anything that rhymes with Nahum. But in the book of Nahum, what is the key event that happens? Can you tell from the picture? There's a flood. What you can't tell from the picture, you wouldn't know directly from the picture, is this is the city of Nineveh. Remember that city that Jonah preached to that repented? God's compassion was put on display? Well, we come back about 100 years later, and sadly, Nineveh is right back to its old, wicked, sinful ways. And this time, the prophet goes and he says, your judgment is sure, it's coming, it's impending. But they thought they had these powerful walls that they could keep out any fighting force that would come against them. Nahum, the people of Nineveh in Nahum's days thought, sure, there's no way people could break through. But God sent this flood that washed out a section of the walls and allowed the people of Babylon to come marching right into the city. So Nahum, flood, but it's a picture of God's judgment. This is a good picture. This is pretty good. First of all, what's the picture a picture of? Forget what's wrapped around it. Just what's the thing there? It's a tower, yes. But it's not just any tower. What kind of tower is it? It's a watchtower. And in the book of Habakkuk, Habakkuk goes up on the watchtower, literally in the book. He goes up and he's looking out, he's looking for God. He wants God to do something. Because the children of Israel, more specifically the children of Judah, have been wicked. And Habakkuk says, God, I want you to do something. I'm looking, God, for you to do something to your people, to get them stirred up, to get them repenting, to get them on the right way. Surely, God, you're going to do something. He watches, and then he doesn't believe what he sees. He doesn't believe what God tells him. God says, I'm going to do something all right. I'm going to bring the Babylonian Empire down here, and they're going to cart you all off into captivity. And then Habakkuk is like, whoa, that wasn't what I was looking for, not what I was watching for after all. You're really going to do it? Yeah, that's exactly what I'm going to do. So God sends judgment in this book of Habakkuk, but Habakkuk is on the watchtower. He's looking to see what God's going to do, and he can't believe what God does. Well, we got two books start with Z here towards the end. We can separate them out pretty easily here because this is the book of Z. What's this up here? It's a fan. So that's the book of Zephaniah. Zephaniah, okay, so we got a Z and a fan. Zephaniah. And remember what the sun stands for. What's the sun stand for? Day, and it's the day of the Lord. Zephaniah is about the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord is a time period of judgment that is coming and is not here yet. So there's future events described in some of these minor prophet books. But he is looking ahead towards the day of the Lord, a day of God's wrath, a day of God's judgment. Okay, we'll back up way back in Israel's history a little bit here. This last book that starts with an H. Actually, you can't tell it starts with an H yet. First of all, what's this letter? I. What's that guy doing? He's giving it Haggai. This is the book of Haggai or Haggai. Okay, it's kind of lame. But again, we're towards the end of the Old Testament and we're getting tired. All right, so it's Haggai, book of Haggai. And in Haggai, can you tell in the background what they're all excited about, what they're hugging over and being thankful for? What's being built back here? Temple. So the book of Haggai is the prophet Haggai is actually a contemporary of Zerubbabel and Ezra. So this book was written back during that time period. So if you're reading in Ezra, it would be appropriate to take a short little read through the book of Haggai because it goes back and talks about that same time period. Basically, Haggai comes along and is encouraging the people to get up and build God's house. All right, and then we went to the last Z book. We already had Zephaniah, but this Z isn't fanning itself. This Z is crying. So this is Zechariah. This is the book of Zechariah. Zechariah is looking forward. He's crying, but I don't know if that's all tears of sorrow. They're tears of joy too, because who's coming? Who does he see on the horizon? Messiah is coming. Messiah is coming. What a great truth. That Messiah. And actually, Zechariah is also a contemporary along with Haggai and Zerubbabel and Ezra. But his focus isn't so much on the here and now building the temple for them. It's on the fact that Messiah is going to come. And one day he will inhabit that temple. He will live there in Jerusalem where that temple is. And he will rule from that temple. So Messiah coming. And then our final book, we have up here in the corner here. This is you tell what that is? Hitting the rock? It's a mallet. So this is the book of Malachi, or Malachi, just Malachi, write it in, okay. Malachi. And Malachi is the final word from God before the time of Christ. After Malachi, there'll be 400 years of silence. And Malachi is bemoaning the fact that Israel's people, during his time period, had hearts of stone. The hearts that were not tender towards the things of God. Hearts of stone. And he says, he promises there's coming a day when someone's going to come just like Elijah, proclaiming the good news. And until then, though, you have hearts of stone. One day, God's going to take that heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. And he's talking about the new birth. And he's hinting at that anyway in the book of Malachi. The final word from God. All the minor prophets are not necessarily in order, but Malachi is the final one. It is appropriate that it's at the end, because it's the final word we get from God before the time of the New Testament. 400 years of silence, and then Jesus comes. All right, next week when we come together, we'll play a game where we will use all this stuff here. I was going to do a game tonight, but it looks like I'm out of time. So I had a review game to do tonight. I'll just save it for next week. It's okay. We're going to send you to your prayer groups. You don't need to, I don't care. If you want to pick out a book and talk about it a little bit, that's fine. But I'm more concerned about you spending some time in prayer for one another, with and for one another, okay? So, and you can cut the live feed. Asher's going with Nathan's group because he's with Josh probably, right?